Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. I hope you're doing well. All right, our audio check worked out here, so let me just mute this. So again, happy Thursday. I hope you're doing well. Another stream. So keeping with the schedule of streaming at 2 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays. Today's topic is working with the property pane in SharePoint Framework Webparts. So let's switch over to our demo screen here. So this is just a site in one of my developer tenants. And we're going to build some web parts. Initially, they'll just work in the, we're going to build a web part. And that web part is going to work in the local workbench to start out. And then we'll actually start using some information from this SharePoint site and have that interact with, or have the properties use the information from the site. So I have a web part project here. It's using no JavaScript UI framework, so just basically HTML and JavaScript. And the only thing I've done is just reformatted this markup because, the current generator kind of doesn't format it correctly. But other than that, it's just a brand new project, web part project. So we can come over to our terminal window here and do a gulp serve to see what the web part project template gives us. So when that runs, it's going to start up the local workbench, the one that is completely disconnected from SharePoint. And we'll be able to see what we get from the template. Oh, build failed. I didn't expect that. Oh, that's just because of copy and paste error. So that should be, let me just go to here. That should be that string right there. When I reformatted this markup, I just forgot to change that. So let me just save, and that should fix that build error. So we'll just monitor our console window to make sure that that's the case. Yep, it is. Okay, so here's our local workbench, and there is our web part. And one of the things that the web part template includes is a property. So I can click the little pencil or pen icon here to open up the property pane, which we see over here on the right. And the value that's shown above the Learn More button, in this case it's the text Twitch property pane, is the value of the property, which we can modify over here in the properties window. So we can just change that. And you can notice as I'm typing, it's changing. So I can set that to hello Twitch. And you can see that that changes in the web part. Okay, so the native behavior of the web part property pane is to update have the properties immediately update the web part. Okay, so reactive, which is not to be confused with React, the UI framework, but the pane is reactive, meaning that as you make changes, they're reflected immediately in the web part. Now, let's look at a couple things over here in the property pane. So we have Twitch property pane at the top. That is the name of our web part. Then there's the text description. Then there's the text group name. And then there is a text input with a label description field. Okay. So let's take a look and see where that user experience or that user interface is described. So let me just get out of Zoom here and come back over to Visual Studio Code. And if we go to our web part and we scroll down to the bottom, you can see here we have the property pane configuration method. Right. So the property pane can have multiple pages. By default, it just has a single one. Right. So you can see that pages array. And then each page can have a header. Right. And each page can also have multiple groups. So it's this code here that is describing the user interface for the property pane. Right. So if I get out of here, now you can see that the text for the description is coming from strings property pane description. So this enables us to localize the text depending on the user's preferred language. So under loc over here, LOC, we can see that there is an en-usjs, right? And there is the property pane description, the group name, and the description field label, right? So those strings describe what you'll see over here, right? So I have a choice when building or describing the UI for the Webpart property pane. Do I want to just hard code in the strings into the Webpart property pane, and that's what I'll be doing for the bulk of the demo, or do I want to set it up to support multiple languages, even though in this case it's actually just supporting a single language, but it's set up to support multiple languages should I desire to do so. So just for simplicity, I'm going to just use hard-coded strings. So let's go over here and do a search for lorem ipsum. There we go. And we'll just generate some text here. And that's good enough. This paragraph right there. So close that. And then come back to our project and then just change this to be that text. Okay, so there's our lorem ipsum text in there. For the group name, let's just change that to be, whoops, too many quotes there. Let's just call this custom properties. And then instead of saying description field, let's just say description here as the label for that text box. So description. All right, so I can go ahead and save here. And then come back to the local workbench. And the local workbench will automatically refresh after the compile is done. It's rehosted. Okay, so you can see that our Webpart property value was preserved there. Hello, Twitch. But now if I go, you can see there is the lorem ipsum text as the description. So if I wanted to, have information about the properties that I want to gather, there you can see my group name is changed to custom properties, and also the label for the text box is changed as well. Right, so you can use the markup I showed you in that method to be able to describe how what you want the user experience to be like over there in the property pane. Now, another thing is the default value for the property. And this doesn't work for all the different kinds of properties. Oh, my apologies. This doesn't work for all the different kinds of properties. It works for simple properties like text or numbers and that kind of stuff. But what we can do is over here in our project, if I open up the manifest, so it's the Webpart name plus .manifest.json. One of the things in here is the default value for the properties. Okay, so right now the default value for the description property is Twitch property pane. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to change that value. Now, why is the property name description? Well, they come back over to our web part. We can see that this web part has a property. So this interface, iTwitch property pane web part props, defines that this web part has a property called description, which is a string. Okay. And also down below in our property pane configuration, we also see that in the property pane text field, this is what says we want to have a text field. It is linked to the description property by the first parameter. Okay, so we have an interface which defines the properties that are used by the web part. In the property pane editor, we define what property we're editing by using the name of the property. And then in the manifest, we define what the default value for that should be. So let's just change this to, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. How about 1 ring to roll them all? Okay, then I'll go ahead and save. All right, so in a second, the web part should refresh. And there you can see the property value is still hello Twitch. So in the manifest, I'm defining what I want the default property value to be. But here we already have a property value set, right? So it's not going to apply to this web part instance. But if I click the discard link over here in the top left to discard that instance of the web part and then create a new one, here. Oh, and sorry, I changed the manifest, so I need to restart my gulp serve. So let me just discard this again, close the local workbench. If you change CSS or JavaScript, TypeScript, that will get picked up. If you change a configuration file, like a JSON file, then you do need to restart your gulp serve for that to get picked up. So let's go ahead and do that. So this will restart the local workbench. And we just need for it to get to the point where it's ready to host the web part. We're waiting for the task reload. There it is. All right, so now if I add my web part, there you can see now it's picked up the default value. Okay. So that is setting the property value, the default value, working with the user experience or user interface over here in the property pane, and again the basics of the properties. And let me go through that again. I went through it fairly quickly, right? So you're going to have an interface which describes the properties that are available on the web part. This interface is linked to the web part itself through this generic here, this generic parameter. Excuse me. And then we define how we're going to edit the properties down here in our get property pane configuration method, and we can set the default value for the property in the manifest. All right, so that is the basics of working with properties. Let's add a new property. So I'll add a really simple property, and it's just going to drop down. Excuse me, where we can pick a color. All right, so what I'm going to do is come up to my interface and just say we're going to have a new property called color, and it's going to be a string. And then we want to show the color on the web part. So I'll just copy and paste the markup here that shows the description property, and I will now tell it to show the color property. So notice we access the property values in the web part through the properties property. So it's this.properties, and then we can access the individual properties from there. And then now I want to add an editor for our property down here, and that is going to be a drop down. Okay, so I'm just going to grab this markup or this code here, and so I'll add a comma. This is an array, and notice we're getting a squiggly here on property pane drop down. So what I need to do is just add an import so that the editor is aware of that. So it's up here at the top. So it's coming from the at Microsoft/sp-property-pane package, and it is property pane dropdown. So you can see some of the properties that are available here. So we got a button type, checkbox, choice group. We want the dropdown. Property pane dropdown here. I added that in to my imports, and then now that squiggly goes away, right? So again, I have a property called color. I'm going to use the this.properties.color to show that in the UI. And now I have the property pane dropdown for the color. I've hard-coded the options in this case. So for a dropdown, there are 2 properties for every entry in the dropdown. The key, that's what's going to be given to the web part. And then the text, that's going to show in the dropdown. Okay, so if I ask my web part for what the color property value is, it'll be whatever the key is for the selected property. And then in the dropdown, you'll actually see the text, red, green, and blue. Now I've got those values both the same. We'll see an example later on where they're different. Where we have our text, red, green, we'll have list names and list IDs, which are GUIDs. So we'll see an example of that a little bit later on. But for right now, I've just got the keys and the properties the same. And then just like before, I want to set the default value. So let's come back over to our manifest here. And I'll add in color. Oops. And this we'll set the default to blue. Okay, we'll go ahead and save that. And again, I've updated my manifest, so I just need to restart the gulp serve. So let's go ahead and close down the workbench and stop the gulp serve by doing Control-C, and then restart it. Okay, so just wait till we get to our reload task. And then come back over to our local workbench, add the property, and there you can see the default value blue. And if we go into edit the web part, we can see we now have our drop down with red, green, and blue. And if I change the value in the dropdown, you can see that that gets reflected immediately in the web part. All right, so that's adding a simple property using one of the built-in SharePoint Framework property editor controls. But one thing, you don't always want these web parts to be immediately reflected in, the property values to be immediately reflected in the web part. So what you can do is you can tell the web part, no, I want to set the properties, but only apply them by clicking on the apply button. Okay, or clicking on an apply button. Okay, so how do we add that apply button in? Well, it's actually very simple. We just override a property in the web part. So if I come back to my property, my web part code here, and just go ahead and grab this code here. So there's a method, sorry, a property. It's a read-only property called disable reactive property changes, and you just return true to say I want to show an apply button, and I only want the property changes, property value changes, to be applied when I click that button. Okay, so if I go ahead and save here. So there our property, or sorry, our web part is refreshed. So if I click on Edit Web Part, we now see there's an Apply button down in the bottom right. Actually, you can't see it because my video is hiding it. Let's see if I can just resize the window here. There you go. Now you can see the Apply button. Okay, and so if I change the color to, say, green, notice it does not reflect in the web part until I actually go ahead and click the Apply button, and now you can see it. Okay, so it's really just setting that property. It's do you want reactive or, I guess, non-reactive? I guess assume is the opposite value or opposite description for your web part properties. Another thing you might want to do is to validate your web part property values. Okay, so again, you're going to do that by overriding a method that's native to or part of the base web part class. So let's take a look at that. So what I want to do is just want to make sure the description, like, have that be a required field, right? So I can even like put a star here to indicate it's required. And then what I can do is just go ahead and add in a method. That will validate the description. Okay, so I've added a method called validate description. It's going to receive a value that's a string. It's going to return a string. So basically, the way that this function works, and sorry, I said override a method. I was thinking about something different. This is just a custom method. This is not an override of a base class method. But the way it works is if the string you return is not empty, then it considers the value, it considers that as the error message, so it considers the property value to be not valid, right? So we're going to be passed the description value, and if it's null, or if its trimmed length is 0, then we'll have the message, please enter a description. Okay? And then all we need to do now is hook up that method to the property. So down here in our property pane text field, we can add in, there's a new property we can set, which will point to our validate description method. So it's on get error message, and we'll set that to be this dot validate description dot bind to this. Sorry, no semicolon there. Okay, so that tells the property pane text field that I want to use that function, validate description, to do our validation. Okay, so our gulp serve was running. Okay, so over here, if I go ahead and edit the web part and then just delete all of the text there, now we can see that the text box is turned red, and it's saying please enter a description, and you can't see it because my video is covering it, but the apply button is grayed. So it won't let me apply the change because the property value is invalid. Okay, so let me just again resize this so you can see down here the apply button is grayed. And as soon as I start typing, now I will be able to apply. And again, if I remove that, then the apply button gets grayed again. Okay, so you can use the on get error message property of the editors, the property pane editors, to validate that your property is in a valid state before you try to apply it. Just one last thing here. Let me set the text to something valid. So we've got one ring to rule them all. So let's add the one ring to find them. So I've made the change, but if I don't click the apply button, it doesn't get changed. So if I just go and close the property pane, and that value never gets applied to the web part. Whereas if it was reactive, then it would get applied and I have to reverse it out. So again, really, there's no, in some scenarios, using the reactive property pane has value, and I find personally, in more scenarios, it makes sense to have the apply button. So you only apply the property changes when you really want to. All right, so that is a hard-coded example of a dropdown. But what if I want to have those values populated dynamically? So instead of having them defined right in the property editor, I want to have them retrieved from, say, SharePoint or a web service or some other backend service. So what I'll do is I'll rough that in with still some hard-coded values, but those hard-coded values will be elsewhere. And then we'll actually go to SharePoint and we'll get those values. Okay. So come back over here. And what I'll do is that I'll add a new property called list. Okay, go away. There we go. So I'm gonna basically show the list of lists in a site, and excuse me, I want to pick one of those lists. So I'll say list here, and it's actually, I think it's an iProperty drop down. Let me just remember. No, it's a string. It's the other thing. So the list is a string. And then I want to show the value of the list just like I did before with the color. So I'll copy and paste this. And it's this dot properties dot list. And then just like before, I want to use the drop down. So let's just copy and paste this. Okay. But this time, the property value I want to edit is list. The label will be list. And again, I don't want a hard-coded set of options. Let me go ahead and delete that out. So we'll say that our options are coming from this dot lists. Okay, so we're going to have a property, a class level variable that will store the lists. So that looks like this. Actually, remember the syntax here. Actually, I'll put both of these in. I'll explain the second one a little bit later on. So let's come back up to the top of our class here and add those in. Okay, so we're going to have a class level variable called lists of type iPropertyPane dropdown. It's an array of that. iPropertyPane dropdown option. It's an array of that. And then we're going to have another property saying list dropdown disabled. So again, we're going to dynamically load the values in the dropdown. So while we're loading those values, so while we're retrieving them from SharePoint or the backend web service or whatever it happens to be, we want the dropdown to be disabled. Okay, so iPropertyPane dropdown option is a squiggly. I just need to get that type reference from the package. So it's iPropertyPane dropdown option. Then I'll remove that squiggly. Okay. And now we just need some code to actually load the lists. So let's go ahead and grab that code. And I'll put that down here close to where we actually have our property UI defined. All right, so as I mentioned, right now we're just going to sort of rough it in, and then we'll actually implement the retrieving the list keys or IDs and names from SharePoint. But basically, we want to simulate a promise, an asynchronous operation. So we'll return a promise of iProperty pane drop-down option, an array of those. Okay, and in the promise, there's two parameters that are resolve and reject. I think I'll do a stream probably at some point on asynchronous programming with the SharePoint framework. But in the promise, the two parameters here are resolve and reject, and we use those to indicate whether the promise completed successfully or it had an error. So you can see here using resolve to return the array of iProperty pane drop-down options. Right. So again, these are just hard-coded keys or IDs and names of libraries in this case. And we're going to use a set timeout to simulate a long-running task. So we'll have this sit for 2 seconds and then return those values. Okay. So there's our load list method, and now all we need to do is somehow get those lists into our actual dropdown. Okay. So we do that through an event which indicates that the property pane is loading. The handler for an event that indicates the property pane is loading. Okay, so that's this guy right here. Okay, so it's on property pane configuration start. And so right now we're checked to see is the class level variable lists populated? If it is, just return, right? So we're only going to go get the list once per instance of the web part. Now, we might want to have some code in that says, well, maybe cache the lists for a certain amount of time, and after that cache expires, then go retrieve them again. But for this particular example, this is fine. Then we're going to have this.list dropdown disabled as true. So while we're retrieving the list values, we want to disable the dropdown. Then we'll start off the call to the asynchronous method. So that is this.load lists. Sorry, let me do this and then do this here. Okay. And then when that resolves, so when that asynchronous call resolves, we'll be given the set of list options, and then we'll go ahead and copy those into the list's class level variable. We'll tell the dropdown to now enable itself, and then we'll tell the property pane to refresh. So we do that by saying this.context.propertyPane.refresh, and then we re-render the web part itself. Okay. So let's just review that one more time. So we added in the property pane dropdown. At the top here, we added in the list property. We created the two class level variables, right? We updated our UI to show the value of the selected list. We added the code to get the lists. And then we added the code to populate the dropdown when we go to, when we open up the property pane editor. Okay, so all of those things combined now should get us to the point where we can see that in action. All right, so I've done a save. That should do a gulp serve. So we're at a reload task. All right. So now if I go to the property pane editor, well, you should see the last property drop down. should start out grayed, and in 2 seconds it should be enabled, and then we should be able to pick one of our two hard-coded lists. Okay, so I'll do that. There we can see. I don't know if it shows up, but it was grayed. Now it's not grayed, and then there are our two values. Okay, so if I pick Site Assets and then click Apply, there we can see our key. So with the color, the key and the text are the same. So the value we see over here in the property editor is the same value we see on our web part. But for the lists, the text for the property pane dropdown option is the list name, but the key is the ID. Okay, so when we ask the web part for the property value, we get the key. Now, what I could do, if I wanted to, and I'll show you an example of this a little bit later on, is I could add code to go and actually find the list whose ID is that GUID, and then show the list name in the web part. So I just have to add a function into the web part to be able to do that. I'm not going to add that for this particular example, but that's what you would do. And you could use like there's a couple different functions you can use. Probably use a map, or if you're using jQuery, you could use a grep or some other mechanism to go iterate the array of property pane options and find the one whose key matches the one that was selected. All right, so that is dynamically populating the dropdown with hard-coded values. Now let's update our web part to actually go and get the lists, both IDs and names from SharePoint. Okay, so I'll just close that, and I'll come back to our web part project. I need to add in a couple of imports and a couple of interfaces. Sorry, one import and a couple of interfaces. So let's go ahead and do that. So I can add those here. All right, so we have the one import. It's importing SP HTTP client from @Microsoft/SP-HTTP. That is the type that allows us to do REST API calls to SharePoint. And then the two interfaces we have describe the shape of the data we'll get back when we make our REST API call. All right, so when we ask for the collection of lists from a SharePoint site, it is going to give us back an object that has a property called value, which is an array of objects, each of which represents the data for a list. Okay, so that's the iList collection interface. It says there's a property called value, which is an array of iList objects. And then for each list, we'll get several properties, but the two that we care about are the ID, which is a GUID, which we'll treat as a string in this particular example, and the title, which is the name of the list. Okay, so here we're just describing the shape of the data we're going to get back when we make our REST API call. So down here now in our load list, we want to replace that with a function that will actually go and query the data from SharePoint. So let's go take a look at that. All right, so the first thing we'll do is we'll use the web part context to find the current site. So that is the this.context.pagecontext.web. That's an object which gives us information about the current site. And then one of its properties is the absolute URL. So that's the absolute URL to a SharePoint site, the current SharePoint site, where the web part is hosted. And then we can use the REST API to get the list objects, the collection of list objects. Excuse me. So that's _API/web/lists. And we've added in an OData filter to say don't give us back hidden lists. Right, so any system lists, we don't really need those in our dropdown, so we'll just filter those out. And then we'll use the SP HTTP client object off of the web part context to make a GET request to the SharePoint REST API. So that's this code here. So the first parameter is the URL that I just constructed in the variable above. So that's the _API/web/list with the OData filter. And the SP/HTTP client.configurations.v1, that just defines like what headers will be used. So, you know, what version of OData are we going to request? Do we want metadata or not? So we're just going to use the default values there. That'll return a promise. So we'll wait for that promise to complete. And then, again, when I say promise, I mean it's an asynchronous process. So we'll wait for that asynchronous process to complete. And then we're going to check to see, did we get back a error or not? And the way you check that with, this is the fetch API that's being used here, is the response has a property called OK. So if OK is true, that means our call was successful. If OK is false, that means it failed in some way. You know, so maybe we got an authentication error, or there was like a server error or something like that. Okay. So if the response is OK, we'll take the response data, convert it to JSON. So that's response.json. That is an asynchronous process, so we'll wait for that to complete. And then we actually get back our data. Right? So again, our data is in the shape of an object, which has a property called value, which is an array of objects, each representing the information about a list. Okay, so we've typed our data as iList collection. We're going to map each object in that collection, so data.value.map, as a iPropertyPane dropdown option. Right, so iPropertyPane dropdown option says there's two properties. One is the key, and one is the text. So we'll set the key to the ID of the list, and we'll set the text to the title of the list. And then we'll go ahead and resolve the promise to indicate that asynchronous process is now complete, returning our array of iPropertyPane dropdown options. If response.OK is false, then we'll convert the response body to text, which will give us the error message, and we'll reject our promise, giving back the error message. Okay, so now we're actually getting the lists information from SharePoint rather than having it hard-coded. So I can go ahead and click Save here. Now, whoops, I clicked obviously the wrong thing. Let me save again. So now I can't run this in the local workbench because the local workbench is completely disconnected from SharePoint. So what I have to do instead is run it in the hosted workbench. So I'm going to come over here and close the local workbench. I'm going to use this site as the host. So let me just go into site contents. So we can see we have lists named categories, customers, order details, orders, products, version history test. We have some libraries, documents, form templates, site assets and style library, and our site pages library. Okay. So to get to the hosted workbench, we go to the site URL and then append /layout/15/workbench.aspx. And that takes us to the hosted workbench. And now we can run the web part that's being hosted locally in this workbench, but be connected to SharePoint. All right, so if I open up the toolbox here, our web part is called Hello, no, it's called Twitch Property Pane, I believe. So come down here, keep going, there we go, Twitch Property Pane. Okay, so there is our web part. But now if I open the edit web part, or open on the property pane, and then drop down our list drop down, now we can see the lists coming from SharePoint itself. So if I pick the products list and then click apply, now we can see that's the actual GUID for that list in my SharePoint site. Okay. So what if I want to actually show the list name rather than the GUID? And actually, what if I just want to in general handle property pane value changes? Okay, so let's take a look at that. So let's come back over to our code here. So what I'll do is I'll add in oh, you know what? I've actually gotten a little bit ahead of myself. I wanted to do a demo before I do this. So let's just save and leave that. I will show you how to handle the changes, but I want to do it with a different property. So the built-in properties, as I mentioned, you can see what's available here. So there's a button, a checkbox, a choice group. So those are radio buttons. Drop down, field type, horizontal rule label. There's more here as well. Oh, those are the props. Yeah. So there's a slider. There's a toggle. There are a few built-in property editor controls, but in general, they're very simple property pane editor controls for simple values like booleans and strings and numbers and that kind of stuff. But what if you want something more complex? Let's say, for example, we wanted a people picker. Well, that's not natively built into the SharePoint framework. So we could build a custom people picker ourselves. At some point in the future, I probably will do a stream that talks about how to build custom property editors. It's a relatively complex topic, but it's definitely doable. But there's also a set of property pane controls that we can use from the Patterns and Practices team or the P&P team. So if I search for SharePoint Framework property pane controls, there it is, the GitHub repo for the P&P property pane controls. Okay, so there's several of them. You can see here there is a code editor, collection data, color picker, a date time picker, a field list picker, multi-select. There's a whole bunch of them. And one of them is, where is it? The people picker, field spinner, swatch, term, people picker right there. Okay, so we're going to use this control from the P&P SPFX property pane controls to add a people picker. All right. So the first thing I need to do is just add in the Npm package that has all of these controls. So that's in the home page there. You can see that. So let's come back to here. Let's stop serving up our web part. And then let's run that npm install command that it gives us. And then once that's done, let me go back to the people picker here. I'm going to need to import, add a few imports. So let me just copy those to the clipboard. Okay, so wait for our npm command to complete. Just take a couple more seconds. And just imagine the Jeopardy countdown music playing in the background here. It's funny when you're doing like live demos. It always seems that these npm install commands or whatever take way longer than they do when you're not, live streaming or doing a demo in front of a crowd. But that's done. so now I can come up to add the imports. So let's add them here. And I'll just reformat this. So put these on separate lines. And I need one more property, or type, which is the I property field, group, or person. All right, so those are the imports. So it is from the @pnp/spfx-property-controls/lib/property field picker. And there are the properties. So property field, people picker, principal type, and iProperty field, group, or person. Okay, so I'm going to add a new property called users, which is an array of property field, group, or person. Okay, so this people picker, even if you configure it to give you back an individual user or group, it still gives you back an array. So I'll say that we're going to get an array back. And then let's go back to here. And here is the syntax you use to add the people picker into your property pane. So let's just grab that and come back over to our project here and scroll down. Okay, so our property is users, and the label I want is going to be user, and again the property is users. And then I want to be able to show the selected user. Okay, so that's an object. Actually, it's an array of objects. It's not even just an object. So let's add in a function. So let's see here, private get user name. So we'll say here, let result equal null, and then return result. And we do want to say that this returns a string. Okay, so we have the property called users. So we're going to say here, if this dot properties dot users. Okay, so I'll check to see if it's null. Sorry, if it's not null, that's my mistake. And this dot properties dot users dot length is greater than 0. Right, so we actually have some users in the array. Then what I want to do is just go get the first user. Okay, so that will be let first user equal this dot properties dot users at 0. Okay, and then I want to say result is equal to first user dot full name. All right, so this will get the username, and if there wasn't a user selected, it will just return null. And now we can go ahead and add in to the UI here the code to call that. So that will be, we want to call this get username to show the user. Okay, so I believe I've done everything correctly. So let's go ahead and save here. We'll find out, obviously, if I didn't. All All right, so let's come back to here and do a gulp serve. Okay, this is opening up my local workbench. I'm not going to use the local workbench. I'm going to use the hosted workbench. Okay, it's at reload. So I can come over here and refresh. Okay, and now I can go edit the web part. And now we see the people picker. So one of my users called Adele. So I can, oh, let me see, it's blocking. Hold on. Let me just redo that. So let me just resize this so you can see it without my video blocking anything. There we go. All right. So now under user, I can pick Adele. There you can see Adele shows up as an option. I can select Adele and then select apply. And now we can see Adele's name here in the web part. Okay, and if I go ahead and clear that out and then click apply, that goes back to being empty. And if I now choose, instead of Adele, I choose Megan, I can do that and apply. Now we can see Megan's name there. All right, so that you can see it was actually quite easy, right? So just bring in the npm package that implements the P&P property pane controls, and then just follow the guidance. And most of the properties editors are relatively simple to work with, but you can get some pretty powerful value out of that just by going ahead and adding in that npm package. All right, so now previously I mentioned that we wanted to handle property pane value changes. So let's go ahead and do that. And there's a little bit of an issue here, and this may be just there's a piece that I'm missing that I don't understand how something works, but let's talk about a couple different ways that you can handle property pane changes. So the way that the SharePoint framework provides for you is there's a method that you override. It's down here. Yeah, it's on property pane field changed. Okay, so this is a method that's part of the base Webpart class that you can just go ahead and override. All right, so let's put this down here near our property pane stuff, down here. Okay, and right now, well, actually, let's just take a look at it first. So you get the property path, you get the old value and the new value. Okay, so the property path is the name of your property, right? So I have properties like description, color, user, list, right? So whatever property is the one that changed, then that will be the value of property path. And then you get the old value, which could be something simple like a string or a number, or it could be an object or an array, and then the new value, right? And then you can just determine how you want to how you want your web part to behave based on the changes. But, and this is where it could be just my understanding of how this works. This works great if the property pane is reactive, but it doesn't behave the way I think it should, or the way I think you need to, when the property pane has an apply button. So let's take a look. Let's just go ahead and save here. And you can see I have a debugger statement in there so we can see when this runs. So we'll wait till this gets down to reload. And then come back to our hosted workbench. Our hosted workbench does not refresh automatically. So there we can see our web part refreshed. And let's just open up the debug console by pressing F12. And now let's open up our property pane, sorry. And let me just change the color, or the value of the color property. Okay, so I'll go from blue to green. So we've hit the on property pane field changed. And you can see, oh, I guess you can't see when I'm zoomed. Let me try the live zoom. The live zoom doesn't really seem to work all that fantastic. What do I have that set to? Control 6. Okay, Control 6. Did that work? Control 6. There we go. All right. So let's see here. If I hover over property path, you can see is color. Okay. So that's the value so that's the property that changed. The old value was blue, and the new value is green. Okay. So this is working the way we want it to, except for the fact, and let me just get out of Zoom, that we haven't clicked the apply button yet, right? So yes, the property changed and we got notified of it. Sorry, the property value was changed in the property pane, but we haven't applied that change yet. So again, if I go ahead and close the property pane at this point, then that change that I was notified of through this mechanism never actually got applied to my web part. Okay. So what I think there needs to be is some event that gets raised when you click the apply button. And as far as I know, that doesn't exist. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe I just haven't hit it on Google. But I don't think there is. Okay. So it's my understanding that you need to apply like a different strategy to be able to handle property value changes when you have the apply button. So the way we're going to do this, every time I make a change and click apply, you don't really see it, but the web part does re-render. Okay, so the render method on the web part gets called. So what we can do is store the previous value of the properties that we want to find out about changes for. And then in the render method, we can compare the current value of the property to the previous value of the property to see if it's changed and then decide how to behave. Okay, so over here, whoops, sorry, in our class, I'm going to add in private previous user name. And that will be a string, and it will start out being null. Okay, and then down at the end of my render method, I'll say let current user name equal this dot get username. Okay, so that's the current value of, or the current full name property of the selected user, right? And I want to compare that against previous names. So if current name is not equal to this dot previous name, username, then I want to do something. Okay, we'll just do an alert for the purposes of this demo, but I could go and do something within my UI as well. So I want to do is just say alert the selected user. Let's see. The user property value was changed to plus, and then current username. Okay, and then we'll say here this dot previous username is equal to current username. Okay, so we store the previous username. If the current username is not equal to the previous username, then we just show that in the UI. In this case, again, I'm just doing it with an alert. and then we update the value of the previous username. Okay, so I can do Control S here, and that should update. That'll run our build task, rehost the web part. Okay, it's at reload. So now I can go ahead and refresh the web part and the hosted workbench. Now we can see that the username value was changed to Megan Bowen. So this is because I'm working with an existing web part. There's no simple way to handle when you bring, like, you run a new instance of a web part that already existed on the page. So that's something you'd have to persist that value out and then read it from some kind of persistent store. But you can see that was set to to alert out that Megan Bowen is the current user. So now if I go into edit the web part and change the color and apply, we don't get any alert because the user didn't change. If I clear out the user and click apply here, you can say the excuse me, the username property value was changed to null. Again, I can improve that UI, so change null to maybe have it just saying that the user value was cleared or something like that. And then if we change it to say Alex Wilbur and then click apply, you can see the user property value was changed to Alex Wilbur. And then that's what shows here in our web part. So again, it's really, if you're using reactive web part properties, then this whole apply thing doesn't apply to you, no pun intended. So you can just use the method that enables you to see what changes there were. So the on property pane field changed method. But if you're using the apply button, then I think you have to sort of manually handle that scenario. Again, it's possible that there is something that I just haven't found yet that does indicate that the apply button was pressed and what the property values are. All right, so that is sort of an overview of working with the SharePoint property pane. We talked about working with the default property editor controls. We've talked about working with the P&P property pane controls. We talked about doing validation. We talked about how to integrate data from SharePoint or some other web API with your property values. So let's, before we finish up, let's just talk about some resources. So in the SharePoint documentation, so again, if we go to docs.microsoft.com /SharePoint. And then down here in the bottom left, we can pick developers. And then under SharePoint Framework, Webparts, Webpart properties, and the property pane. So you can say like configure custom properties, validate Webpart properties, extending the property pane, like building custom controls, or using cascading dropdowns. So there are several articles here in the SharePoint Framework documentation that talks about working with the property pane. And there's also an MS Learn module, or Microsoft Learn module. So if we just search for MS Learn, that'll take us to docs.microsoft.com/learn. And then under products, we drop that down and say browse all paths. So these are learning paths. These are sets of modules. And search for SharePoint Framework. So there's getting started, develop web parts, enable SharePoint Framework web part configuration with property panes. Okay. So this is a whole module that covers similar content to what I just covered in this Twitch stream. And part of that, so there's there's sort of docs, and then the docs are followed by a lab. So a hands-on lab where you go through and build some of this stuff. Okay. So the actual SharePoint Framework documentation, and then the extend Microsoft SharePoint. Sorry, that's not. Is that what I wanted? Yep, it's the learning path is called extend Microsoft SharePoint. So that is the SharePoint Framework development learning path, and I believe there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 modules in there currently in that learning path. All right, so I think that is everything I wanted to cover in this particular stream. So let me switch back to MaxCam here. So we'll be streaming again, or I will be streaming again next Thursday at 2 o'clock. At least that's the plan. Don't know the topic yet. There's several things on my list of things, but I keep saying that I want to cover certain things, and then I end up covering other things. So if you just follow me on Twitter, you can see my Twitter handle down there in the bottom right of the screen. It's at Rob Windsor. I will usually tweet out like a couple times during the week what topics I plan to cover that week. You can also see the name of my YouTube channel. So it's Toronto Geek. So if you go to youtube.com/users/Toronto Geek, you can get to my YouTube channel where I have all of the recordings of these Twitch streams. And then on Twitch itself, the VODs, the video on demand for the streams, is kept currently for 2 weeks. So you can watch recent streams here on Twitch should you like to. If you have any topics that you'd like to see me cover or suggestions about the stream, please feel free to ping me on Twitter is the easiest way. So at Rob Windsor. I'd be happy to hear from you. I'm happy to consider different topic requests. I would like, and I haven't really had it hasn't really happened yet, but I'm hoping in the future that I'll start to get more interactivity in the streams, get some like Q&A going, that kind of stuff. But I realize that takes time, and I'm only like 7 or 8 streams in, so. But I'm hoping over time that'll start to build up, and we'll get more conversation going. And instead of me presenting sort of pre-canned topics, that we'll be able to explore different topics together as a group. So thank you very much for watching the stream if you're watching live, or I hope you've enjoyed the content if you're watching the recorded version. And I hope you stay safe, and I hope you have a great weekend. Thanks. Bye.